Good morning! Come in, and welcome to the Adventurer's Lodge. My name is Destry, and together we're going to do a lot today. One of the first places that I wanted to start was with modeling headstones or grave markers. They're fun, they're cool, kind of Halloween vibes going on, but importantly, they're on the whole relatively simple objects. Like, they're not terribly complex, but they still offer a lot of opportunities, I guess, to both do things correctly and, if you're not careful, do things incorrectly. So I thought it would be a good showcase to start for just going through this process. One of my favorite books on my bookshelf is a dictionary of symbols. And just symbology is really cool. The things that we use as symbols, the way we've drawn and evolved to draw over the course of long periods of time. And death, dying, I know it's a bit morbid, but it's also been something that's been around for a while. Go figure. So one of the things that was really, really interesting is just as I was doing research on the kinds of headstones I wanted to make and the shapes of them, I really wanted to avoid any religious symbols from any particular religion. And that was surprisingly hard to do. Death and religion have kind of had a thing hand in hand for basically ever. And the cross, which is one of the most common headstone shapes that I could find, even though it's a really, really simple symbol in terms of symbology, it does have really, really deep ties to religion. So trying to find headstone shapes that were just sort of neutral, but still read well and were still recognizable for what they were, was actually really hard. Since most of the assets I'll be making will be hand painted, you're actually going to see a lot of me editing UVs and messing around with texel density, which, just for anyone who doesn't know, texel density is it's an acronym or a shortened version of texture pixels, right? So basically, the idea is that you are spreading pixels out over a 3D model. And you don't want to have a situation where one area of your model has a whole lot of pixels and therefore can have a whole lot of detail, and another area has really huge pixels, only a few covering like a massive area. And so your detail quality is going to be really, really poor. Since a lot of these things are going to be hand painted, and that's going to be a big part of the process, just making sure that the texel density both is something that is reasonable for objects of this size, and then also can look good is a big part of the process. So I'm excited to show that off because that's not something you see in a lot of places, in part because it can be tedious and boring as can possibly be. This last grave marker was the hardest by far, and for no good reason. I made it as hard on myself as I possibly could. Every part of it, the modeling, I was just being dumb, and the texturing, or in the UV unwrapping, I was being dumb. I was just being dumb from beginning to end. And it's kind of fun to go back and watch this recording now after I finished it, because it comes out okay, and it looks pretty good. But it's fun to go back and see all of the mistakes I made and all of the ways I could have done it differently. And I find it interesting. It's one of those things where I think whenever you see someone doing something, especially in a time lapse on YouTube, you're like, oh, they knew what they were doing every step of the way. They knew where they were going. They knew what was going on. They knew how to do this thing, whatever it may be. Maybe it's just me, I don't know, but I figure most of the time people have no idea. In any sort of creative work, you kind of just keep going and trudging through the mud until you get to something that is good enough. And I don't know, I'm rambling, but this one turned out pretty well, and I was especially happy with it despite the rocky start that it had. This is kind of completely unrelated to everything on screen right now, but it's another important point that I want to make before we move on, is that there's an idea of shape language. So if you are to take a whole bunch of these and spread them out over an area to make a graveyard or something like that, you want to make sure that the repetition feels as minimal as possible, which can be really, really hard to do. So there was effort put into making sure that these were all different thicknesses, different heights, different shapes. Here at the end, you can see I even go in with the sculpting tools and make sure that they're even asymmetrically deformed slightly, just so that there's variation between them. That way, if you see the same headstone in two different locations, but you're approaching maybe from different angles, they still feel different, even though it's the same asset being used over and over again. And just little things like that really add up to improve the overall quality of models and assets that you can make. It's just making sure that they are usable in as many situations as possible, given what they are. It's super funny how absolutely crazy I went with colors at the start of this process. I have a set of gradients that I've made for pixel art, actually, that I like to use as color ramps for to make color theory easy. I'm not great at color theory, so I like to simplify it wherever I can. But yeah, I went so far overboard with the color in this first one that trying to rein that back in at the end there was a process from beginning to end. But all in all, I'm still glad I used my color palettes, and I'm still glad that I went a little crazy with it. I always think it is better for things to be maybe just a bit too colorful rather than be way too bland. To like look at an environment and go like, goodness, this is boring. Fun story too. This program that I'm painting in currently is 3D Coat Textura, which is just the texturing package from 3D Coat, which is a software creation suite. I had used Substance Painter for basically a really long time, and I'd never touched 3D Coat before. This was my first time ever interacting with it. Um, and I think I like it. It's really wild to just be like, cool, I'm gonna kick off this whole project thing with something I've never done before, and then be like, oh, this is actually way better than previous processes I've used. So definitely check out 3D Coat if you're interested in hand painted textures. I think it's got a lot to offer. And I was recommended it from some other YouTube videos, so I was like, gosh, for sure. But it's funny because even just a moment ago, I used like this really cool 3D gradient tool. Uh, I learned about it literally in that moment. I didn't know it existed prior to fiddling around and being like, oh, what does this button do? One of the things I like about hand painted textures, and part of the reason why just sort of a shift in focus and moving towards things like this more, is there's so much like, oh goodness, especially with AI art becoming bigger and bigger. And ask me in the comments about how I feel about AI art. But one of the things is that it's just really nice and refreshing a lot of times to see things that are created with the intent of being representative rather than being literal. What I mean by that is just that there's so many assets in games where it's like, let's make this realistic. Let's make this as realistic as possible. Let's add more realism. Let's keep going for realism. And it can just become tiresome after a while, you know, where maybe I want things not to be cartoony, not to be like stylized, but I do want some kind of artistic flair introduced into it just to break up what I see from day to day. So I really like this sort of brushstrokey kind of style to hand-painted assets. And it was a lot of fun to get to play around and just mix colors on an object. Kind of reminds me of painting miniatures. Of course, with any sort of game asset type thing, if it looks good out of the engine but doesn't look good in the engine, then it doesn't really matter. So the final step is always going to be able to take these assets and then put them in Unreal Engine 5. And this is what they came out looking like. All in all, I think it's pretty good. Of course, there's things I would change. I think the shadow in the final tombstone is a little intense, but otherwise, I don't know. I think this looks pretty good. And that's that, I guess. I hope you enjoyed your stay here at the lodge, and I hope that you'll come back again sometime. I want to take a moment to just restate my appreciation for my patrons, the adventurers. You guys have been here through a lot of thick and thin, and it has meant everything to me. Productive as today was, it is coming to a close, and the evening's going to be here soon. So please, try and take care of yourselves tonight. Get plenty of restful sleep, hydrate so that you do not dehydrate, and I will see you all in the morning.